I want to talk to you all about a topic. God will awaken your helpers. God will awaken your helpers. Today is Saturday, and many of you are aware from Friday to Saturday, I really try to let that be the day that I call it my Sabbath, where I'm just reading my Bible and praying. And the entire day I've been in the book of Esther since about very, very early this morning. And I am going to do my best to go through the entire book of Esther, but I'm going to really be parking on chapter 6 because that's the main part I want to get to. So I'm just going to go through this a little bit, but there are some important biblical Bible principles in the book of Esther that I'm praying to God you all get. I was not planning on recording anything today, but I just can't put this book down. So let's just go through it. I'm just going to go through a couple things pretty quickly. In Esther chapter 1, basically there was Queen Vashti. That's Vashti. And the shortest version I can give is that she was the queen. King Xerxes, and I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong, Xerxes, but King Xerxes summoned her to come before him at some great banquet, some celebration, whatever it was. And she was very lovely to look at. She refused to go to the banquet. So basically in chapter 1, he just said, you're never going to come before the king again. I'm going to have to find somebody else to replace you. Again, you can read that yourself, but I'm just trying to give you a brief summation. When you get to chapter 2 is all about Esther being made queen. Esther is Mordecai's cousin. Now, this is after the whole exile to Babylon from King Nebuchadnezzar and all of that. Apparently, some kind of way through all of this, she lost both of her parents, and Mordecai ended up raising her. And her real name is actually Hadassah, Hadassah, but that's not even the point I wanted to get at. So she ended up being made queen because basically the king sent out to, find a new queen. And I'll just jump past all of that. She was beautiful. She won over his favor, and it was amazing, and she became queen. I'm just going to jump. In chapter 3, there's a guy named Haman, Haman. Haman was basically, let's just put it like this. Let's just say, I want to say second in command, but he was highly honored by King Xerxes. Now you can read chapter 3, starting in verse 1 on that. And the very bottom line is that the king really liked this guy. And this guy really did not like Mordecai, because now I'm going to pick it up in verse 2. I'm in chapter 3, verse 2. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So Mordecai refused to do this. And I'm going to jump past a little bit, but the very bottom line is that Mordecai would not bow down to him. This really disturbed Haman. Haman could not stand him. And Haman went on to say in verse 6, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So this guy, Haman, really was, tremendously disturbed and did not like him, and just said, I'm going to figure out a way to just take everybody out. So Haman met with King Xerxes, who really don't know much about what's going on with this, and probably at that time didn't care too much, and basically said, can I get your permission to get rid of all of them, all of the people, women, children, young, old, all of them. The king pretty much gave him permission. This is where we're going to start picking some things up. And you can read all through chapter 3 to find out about that. Chapter 4. This is when Mordecai had to go before Esther. Now, many of you are aware with this part of the story, because this is when Mordecai, he tore his robe. I'm in chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that he had done, this is after the edict came out, that they were all going to be, killed. It says he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. So, of course, who wouldn't be, right? He's just found out that everyone's being taken out. And so what I wrote, my little note I wrote on the side of that is this situation looked really hopeless in that moment, right? So Esther finds out about it. Mind you, she's in the king's palace now. She's the queen now. And Mordecai asks her, hey, you got to go before the king. You got to go before the king and get this right. You got to do something to help our people. And Esther, I'm going to pick it up in verse 11, her initial response was, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned to the king has but one law, just one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter. I don't know why I have a hard time saying that word, scepter, to him and spare his life. So she basically just said, hey, you know I can't go before the king because I'll be put to death unless he extends this gold scepter to me. So Mordecai's response is pretty much, hey, could it be possible? He didn't say, could it be possible? He basically just said, you were brought to this position for a reason. So let me read this because I don't want to paraphrase too much. I want to respect what the Bible is saying. So in Esther chapter 4, verse 14, starting in verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? So in other words, who knows? Perhaps this is why God allowed you to be in this position, because you're the main one that has access to the king. Now, I haven't even gotten to the main point that I actually want to get at in this story, but we're getting there really quickly. So Esther basically said, hey, I need everybody to be fasting. We're going to be doing this for about 3 days. Don't eat, don't drink, don't do anything. And then she says, which is one of the most famous verses in the Bible, she says in verse 16, she says, let me find verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or night. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And so we all know that story. So then when you get into chapter 5, she went before the king. He did not kill her. He actually extended the golden scepter to her and basically just said, hey, anything you want, you know, even up to half the kingdom, it'll be yours, because she was beautiful. He loved her. She was, his favorite. And she used an amazing strategy. She said in verse 4, if it pleases the king, let the king together with Haman. Now remember, Haman is the person that, could not stand Mordecai and got this whole edict together. She says, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. And the king said, okay, bring Haman, let's do this. So let's just call it a party. And same thing at this event, this banquet, whatever you want to call it, king said the same thing again. Basically, what do you want? Even up to half the kingdom, I'm in verse 6, even up to half of the kingdom, it will be granted. And then Esther replied in verse 7, basically she just said, hey, I want to prepare another banquet. Just come again. Let me just read it. Esther chapter 5, verse 7. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. So you got two parties basically back to back. Now, pay attention to this part. I've not been able to get off of this, and it looks like I'm 8 minutes into this, and I'm just getting to the point that I wanted to focus on. But I feel like it was important to give a backdrop, because even though many of you may be thinking, well, Z already kind of knew that part of the story, there's a lot of people that probably didn't. So I just want to do my best to make sure I'm including everyone. So Haman, in verse 9, chapter 5, verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. So it says, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. And then it just goes on to talk about how he went home and bragged to his wife about all his wealth. In verse 11, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above all other nobles and officials. And it says, and that's not all, Haman added, I'm the only person, Queen Esther, invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she invited me along with the king tomorrow. Now listen to this. Let's just jump down to verse 14. Haman's wife said to him, have gallows built 75 feet high and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. So Haman was in high spirits, feeling good, got all this wealth, second in command for the most part, let's just say that. Telling his family, bragging about, all the honor he's getting, how I get to be with the king and the queen. And he says, my only thing is I just can't stand this guy Mordecai. And his wife is like, hey, let's have a gallows built. And how about you have him hang on it before you go to the banquet? Now, this is the part, and again, I'm 10 minutes in now, but I'm just getting to the meat of what I wanted to say. This is the part that really moved me. Just when we think that the enemy is winning in our lives, look how God turns around and awakens our helpers. Esther chapter 6, verse 1. That night, the king could not sleep. Now, I couldn't get past that verse right there. That night, the king could not sleep. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. And basically, they read the book of the Chronicles to him, and he found out, he asked a question, hey, what was done for this guy Mordecai? I guess I skipped over one point because I was going a little quick. But in the beginning, two people conspired to kill the king. I forgot to mention that, my apologies. And Mordecai found out about it and told Esther. And Esther is the one that brought it to the king's attention. And they basically ended up catching the two people that was conspiring against the king. So when the Chronicles was read, Mordecai remembered and said, the king remembered and said, well, what honor was given to Mordecai? What do we do for him? So in chapter 6, verse 3, he says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for all of this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, who is in the court? So now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. So now just follow this. Now, I know we talked about Esther before, maybe a couple months ago, but there's some principles in here that we're about to dive into in just a minute that I missed before and I want to talk about. You got to imagine this guy's coming to this party and he just wants to say, hey, really quickly, I want to hang Mordecai real quick and then let's get the party going. So he's coming in the door to do that, right? And so the king basically says to Haman, hey, what is it that we should do for someone that I want to bring honor to? And you can read all through that, but Haman, thinking that the king's talking about him, is saying, hey, let's put a royal robe on him. Let's have him ride the same horse the king rode, and let's put one of the top princes before him to go down the street and proclaim, this. Let me just read it. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor him and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. I just read chapter 6, verse 9, by the way. The king says, go at once. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Go get the robe and the horse and do just what you've suggested for Mordecai the Jew. So basically, Haman's like, you got to be kidding me. He didn't say that in the Bible. I'm just making a point that Haman was just completely, I'd like to use the word embarrassed. Because he had to basically do all of this stuff that he thought was going to be done for him, but for Mordecai, having him go through the city and exclaiming all these amazing things about him. And that he was feeling some kind of way, because it says in verse 12, after Mordecai returned to the king's gate, it says, afterwards Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And basically they just said, hey, you ain't gonna win this if you coming up against them. I don't even know what to tell you. I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much, they just said, we can't do anything about it. So here's where it gets interesting in chapter 7 and 8, which is where I want to park just for a little bit. Queen Esther finally told the king what was going on, and she basically just said, my wish is that you grant my life. I'm in chapter 7, verse 3. She said, that you grant my life. She says, this is my petition and spare my people, for this is my request. And then she just goes on to talk about all the stuff that, Haman had come up with, because the king is just saying, who is this person? Like, who is the man who dared to do this who dared to issue such an edict. And she said it was this vile adversary. In verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Now I'm just going to jump past this because basically the king killed him. The king, it's like, went out into the garden, and by the time he came back, they had his head covered, and they basically went ahead and killed Haman, and he was done. They actually ended up wiping out all of his sons, and ended up giving the house over to Mordecai. So all of his property, everything he had, was pretty much given to Mordecai. Mordecai ended up becoming, pretty much one of the top people at that point in place of Haman. Now here's the piece that I kind of missed when I talked about this a while ago. In Esther chapter 8, somehow I missed this part, or I skipped past it. It says, then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, that's verse 5, chapter 8, verse 5, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite devised and wrote to destroy all the Jews in the king's province. So she just goes on to say, how can I bear seeing this disaster fall on my people? King Xerxes just let her do whatever she wanted. He's like, hey, you go ahead and do whatever you need to do. Mordecai ended up writing a whole nother edict, which the king approved, and, they ended up defending themselves, and the story worked itself out. But I'm going to kind of park on chapter 8 and verse 5 because I missed this. When all of that stuff happened with Haman, and now she's going before the king saying, hey, we got to do something about this. Haman's out of the way, but this edict still stands. So, please, can we get some help to rewrite this or do something? I didn't pay attention to chapter 8, verse 5. And I really believe these are important biblical principles because this is what she stood on. In chapter 8, verse 5, let me back up again in verse 4. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. Now I'm in verse 5. Number 1, if it pleases the king. That's the first thing she said. And that made me think about God. I thought, okay, it almost made me think about Jesus, to be honest with you, when it's not my will, but thy will be done. She says, if it pleases the king. That was number 1. Then the second thing out of her mouth is, and if he regards me with favor. And I wrote down the second principle is number 1, if it pleases God. Number 2, dear Lord, please regard me with favor. Is there favor over my life? So if it pleases God, if he regards me with favor is what she said. And then the third thing she says, and thinks it's the right thing to do. And I wrote down point number 3, is it the right thing to do? And then number 4, she says, and if he is pleased with me, and I wrote down number 4, I put pleased with my life. That for me is a secret Bible principle that I pray to God I never forget. There was 4 points she stood on. If it pleases the king. Now again, this is King Xerxes she's talking about, but I'm looking at the entire story of Esther as I would with Jesus. Because just like Jesus interceded for us that we may be saved, right? Esther interceded for her people, put her life in danger, right? So that they may be saved. So sometimes when I read a Bible story, not only do I want to apply it to my life, but I also want to look at, wow, what are the similarities with this, with other stories in the Bible? Now, you can read the Bible however you want, and I'm no biblical scholar, but this is the way my mind and my spirit moves. So as I'm reading through and I'm learning about Esther, I'm saying to myself, wow, this is so similar to the story of Jesus, and just his response with God, So she says, number 1, in verse 5, she says, if it pleases the king. And then she says, if he regards me with favor. Number 3, she says, if and thinks it's the right thing to do. And number 4, if he's pleased with me. Does that make sense? That really helps me when I go before God to do those 4 reality checks and to ask myself those things, or to ask God, I should say. If it pleases you, if there's favor, if you think it's the right thing to do, and if you're pleased with me. So now, here's the point, the very last point I wanted to make in this, because I think I'm going to title this, God will awaken your helpers. What I think is so phenomenal about this, now I'm going to go all the way back to chapter 6. I just took you on a little bit of a ride, and you guys can read the rest of the book to see what happened. Again, it worked itself out. Mordecai was able to rewrite the edict. They were able to defend themselves. They had tremendous victories. So you go back to chapter 6. I decided to title this, God Will Awaken Your Helper. Well, first of all, I prayed about it, and that's what God put in my heart. Because I thought, and I wrote a note on here, that sometimes it looks as if others, or I should say the enemy, is winning in our lives. Sometimes it looks as if the enemy is winning. But God is able to awaken our helpers. This man, this king, who apparently didn't even fear God, if you really think about it, he was not even able to sleep. And what made him order the book of Chronicles that night to be read to him? And I put in my little notes here, the Spirit was moving. So all this time, you've got a situation that looks really hopeless, right? The edict has been written, and I talked about this before a couple months ago. The king's already sealed it with his ring, which means it really can't be undone. You can only kind of write another edict, which is what they end up doing, which is basically saying, we can't undo this edict, but what I can do is allow you guys to defend yourselves. And that's how they ended up, winning, just so you know. But think about that. Sometimes we can find ourselves, and I know that I've been there, in situations that look so hopeless. Just imagine when that edict was written and Mordecai sat there wailing and tearing his clothes and just looking at the situation that I don't even know what we can do. And then you look at Esther, who initially was like, I can't even go before the king. I mean, the law is that he can take my life. And then you got this guy who already had the gallows built for you and happy about it. But what no one in the story knew is through that night, God awakened Mordecai and Esther's helper. God awakened the helper. God allowed the king, who probably didn't even fear him, if you think about it, God allowed that king to not be able to sleep. And of course, when the Chronicles were read, and he realized that there was a man named Mordecai who basically kept him from being killed, he turned around and said, what is it that we're going to be able to do for this person? And look at the favor that was shown on Esther. Esther would not have been in that position had Queen Vashti not got all up in her feelings, pride and arrogance, whatever you want to call it, and didn't go before the king. That was in chapter 1. Hopefully I'm not going too fast, but that was in chapter 1. She didn't go before the king for whatever reason. Probably had an attitude, whatever. She's like, I ain't going to this banquet. Embarrassed the king. So of course he got rid of her and ended up finding Esther. But look how all that worked out. Look how God awakened the helper. That's what stood out to me. I pray that whatever you may be going through right now, whatever worries or stresses that may be on your plate, whatever it is that may be keeping you up, or thoughts or concerns, and you're not quite sure how this is going to work out, I pray that you remember chapter 5 and chapter 6 of Esther. Because in chapter 5, Haman, if you remember in verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. Sometimes it looks like the enemy is winning. He was happy. He was in high spirits. He was going home to get some gallows built to kill this man. He already was second in command. So who can come against that? What could possibly happen that can change that situation around? But look at what God did, and I pray you don't ever forget chapter 6. Just read. If you don't remember nothing else from this, read chapter 6, verse 1. Just the first line is all I ask you to read. That night, the king could not sleep. What is that, 7 words? 2, 4, 6, 7. Just remember those 7 words. That night, the king could not sleep. God awakened the helpers. I've been in situations in my life, and I've talked about it in some of the episodes before, but there's been so many times, one in particular I talked about, where God moved through the night and awakened my helper. Remember I told you guys a long time ago, and I don't want to make this about money or finance or anything like that. But remember I told you guys about when God, I was in one of the lowest points in my life, and God told me, now it's time to start your business. And I said, but God, I don't have the money. And God put it in my heart to stop and go into this office building. And I only had enough for just like a little closet, let alone an office. And remember I told you guys how the manager of that building, which I can talk about now because he's no longer there. The manager of the building showed me this suite, and it had a reception area and a lounge and this and that, like a really nice area. And I said, I can't afford any of this. I just want like a little 400 by 400. Just give me like a little corner. Just give me something. And then the next day when I came back to sign a lease for just a little, literally almost like a closet, to be honest with you, it was a small space. He said, something kept me up through the night. I couldn't sleep. And something is telling me that I need to give you this suite. And I said, but I can't afford that. And he's like, you just keep your mouth closed. I'm going to do this for you. I got a feeling you're going to grow into this. And I said, well, what room do I get in here? And he says, all of it is yours. Here's the key. And I was on the floor beyond now this is just one story of many I can give you, but that stands out to me because I don't want to say anything. Let me just say this carefully. I'll just say that particular person, well, let me be very careful with this because I don't in any way ever want to put anyone down. I'll just say that he is not afraid to speak his mind, and I don't think he has fear of, I think God's going to come and get me type deal if I don't do what God tells me to do. I'll just leave it like that. He just has a very strong personality, and I love him, by the way. I love him. So if he hears this, know I love you. Wherever you may be at this point in life. But my point is that it wasn't because he was some big religious person. That's probably a better way of saying it. It wasn't because he was some big religious person who's just like, I fear what God's going to say or do. He's just like, man, I just couldn't sleep through the night. Something kept waking me up. Something kept telling me I need to do this. And I'm standing there like, you got to be kidding me. Now that's a weak example, but I'm just talking in general that no matter what you may be going through in life, God has the power and the ability to awaken our helpers. That's the main thing I wanted to park on. So I encourage you to read through the story of Esther, spend some time parking on the 4 biblical principles that I pointed out, which was in chapter 8, verses 5 through 6. When she gave those 4 things: if it pleases the king, if he regards me with favor, if he thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me. Those are the 4 principles she stood on when she went before him. And then jump to go back, I should say, to chapter 6 and just focus on those 7 words. That night, the king could not sleep. So anyway, I hope you are encouraged. I talked a lot longer than I was planning on it, but again, I wasn't even planning on recording anything today. This is my time of my Sabbath to just pray, to meditate, and to be quite honest with you, to get ready for Monday. Starting Monday, I'm going to be discussing my book, Necessary. I don't know how often God's going to have me doing it through the week, but if it is the Lord's will, I will be going live on Monday so that we can begin talking about Necessary. And for those of you who may not know what I'm talking about, I released my book on April 9th, which is the anniversary of my son's death. And it's released as a paperback on Amazon. And actually, hopefully starting Monday or Tuesday, my website will be live as well, so that you can also be able to get the audio or the video version as well. So I'll talk about all that at that time, but I'm getting prepared for that. And that's a whole nother journey God has taken me on. I spent a very long time today at the cemetery, walking around, praying and crying out to God for wisdom and guidance with how he can use me to glorify him and bring honor to him. So between that and being stuck in the book of Esther all day, I was not planning on recording anything. But for whatever reason, it may only be one person that listened to this whole thing because I'm at 28 minutes at this point. But just for that one person who probably stuck all the way to the end, I pray that this is an answer to something you've been looking for. Sometimes it looks like the opposing party is winning, and they may be in high spirits, and they may be boasting and bragging and all of that. But just at the right time, God is able to awaken your helpers. So you hold on, you keep going, and don't you even think about giving up. God is aware of every single thing that's going on in your life, and he loves you. Okay? I love you all. This is Z with Unlocking Greatness Podcast.